Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about overpopulation and some suggested solutions to solving our multiple environmental crises due to lots of people on this planet. With my guest, Jack Alpert. He is founder and director of the Stanford Knowledge Integration Laboratory. He was formerly with high-tech and software companies in management and product design, including Cisco Systems, Banana Fish Software, and Conductus. He has authored numerous papers and publications and is a regular invited speaker to numerous conferences. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, Nancy, it's a pleasure to accept your invitation.
You have been involved in trying to educate the public about the fact that with so many people on the planet, we are ending up with ecological problems, with human conflict problems. You have created some incredible graphics and videos on your website, www.skil.org, but since we're radio, you're going to have to tell me why you believe that 7.8 billion people on this planet is simply too much for the Earth.
Nancy, it's pretty simple. Before we had fossil fuels, the farmers in the valleys, these are 17th century serfs, could support about 600 million people. And they couldn't grow anymore. I mean, for 10,000 years, we never increased the human population above 600 million. And when we got fossil fuels, we could plow more ground, fertilize more ground, transport food over longer distances. Right now, we have 8 billion people on the Earth because we have enough energy to grow food. The problem is that energy looks like it's going away during the next 80 years. By 2100, we won't be able to pump very much oil. We won't be able to mine very much coal. There won't be much natural gas left. Even uranium for nuclear power plants will be difficult to come by because we'll have mined out all of the most dense areas, and all that's left are mines with very low quality ore, and it takes so much energy to mine the ore, refine it, and turn it into materials that can be used in nuclear power plants. Plants themselves won't replace that energy. So the question is, in 2100, we're going to have enough energy to support only 600 million people.
You actually believe that our civilization is extremely vulnerable to collapse because of people using our resources and are running out of those resources.
Right. British Petroleum has done some conservative analysis and believes that our petroleum deliveries will be down 50% by 2050. So the question is, how much of the 8 billion won't eat at all if we drop 50% of our energy deliveries?
You had an interesting video with graphics showing how many people could live with the lifestyle that most people want, the American middle-class lifestyle with house, with other amenities. But yet that's just simply not possible, is it?
Well, I think it's possible, but it's only possible for a very small number of people. The latest video on the website, which you can find at www.skil.org, a non-injury producing civilization essentially said, okay, I'm an engineer. I'm going to design a civilization based on the dense energy that's available in 2100, which I assumed would be hydroelectric dams. Those facilities will still be producing power. So the question is, how many people can have a nice lifestyle if that's all the power that's available? And it turns out that in North America, if you include Bonneville Power, which is all the power of the Columbia River Valley and the Colorado River Valley and the Quebec Hydro north of Toronto, we could support only 10 million people at European lifestyles, sans cars and airplanes. So if you run the numbers, you can actually have enough energy for everybody to have 25 years of schooling, free health care, apartment living, subway transportation, and very high minimum basic income.
In other words, we're supporting a lot of people on this planet, but not with a quality of life, because there are so many people all demanding the resources. It really is encouraging all sorts of violence, climate change, we know, soil loss, where are we going to get the agriculture, water scarcity, pollution. We're managing with a lot of problems.
People should realize that let's assume that technologically we solve every one of those problems, that we don't have the effects of climate change. That won't change the number of people that we can actually support in 2100. It turns out to be not a problem for us because we don't have big storms and we don't have droughts and we don't have floods. So now you have a system without those problems that were caused by climate change. But that doesn't change that you have enough in the gas tank to run them for more than a very small number of people. Biodiversity is exactly the same, that if we only have 50 million people on the face of the earth, and the reason I came up with 50 million is that it's only 10 million in North America using all our dams. There's a place in South America where they have a series of dams that could support 12 to 15 million. And then the Chinese have a series of dams that could support 25 million. But if those are the only communities that are developed and have these lifestyles and there are no other people on Earth, then there's no environmental problem because 92% of, or 98% actually, of the land area would not be affected by human beings. There would be nobody living in Europe, Australia, Russia, Oceania. No, not that we know of. I mean, this is an engineering model. This says, give me some energy, give me some space, give me some rules of operation, and I can design a civilization that will not break down. It will not have weather changes. It will not have biodiversity loss. It will not have social conflict. We've changed the social contract. That social contract, we don't have inequity. We've figured out ways to keep the inequity from getting too big. And so there will be disgruntled individuals, but there won't be factions of 25 or 30% of the community that feel that they've been disenfranchised from the good life.
You use a model of a car in the desert. Could you explain that?
Let's assume that you have a car, and it's a big car. It's a huge car, like the biggest car you've ever seen in your life. And inside that car is a whole civilization. And in that civilization, they are trying to keep the weather right. They're trying to keep the people educated. They're trying to have health care. They're trying to prevent inequity. They're trying to make sure everybody gets a really good education. And they're doing a great job of it. But this vehicle is driving along, and all of these good activities inside this civilization are working fine. And they pass a sign that says, no gas for 800 miles. Okay, that's not a big deal. And the guy who's driving the car, he looks down, he says, full tank. Let's see, I can go 400 miles on a full tank. That means I'm going to run out of gas at the 400-mile mark. And everybody inside this civilization is suddenly going to be standing in the middle of the desert with 400 miles to walk back. So they're all dead. And so the question is, how close is that analogy to what we're doing on the surface of the earth? How much of what we've got going is completely dependent on the energy supply, which if it diminishes to zero, everybody's toast.
We certainly are in need of energy. We're in need of soil. And of course, something that's rarely talked about in this context is the need to leave some land for other wildlife, for the ecosystems that are not developed by human beings. And we need a place for other species to survive and live because in essence, the circle of life, we depend on those species being on this planet.
Well, Nancy, that's correct. But this particular civilization that we designed does no damage to those species because it's so small. The only reason that we as a human community are dangerous to the other species on the earth is because we've usurped all the space. and all the resources, and all the abilities for their food supply are now turned into cornfields that are making alcohol for our cars. We were a very small group of people. Those forests and those fields and those prairies would not be occupied by only 50 million people living a very high lifestyle. But at 50 million of us, we'll hardly make a dent in what the earth can produce. They are not in trouble. The fish in the sea are not in trouble. The animals crawling across the plains are not in trouble. The monkeys in the tropics are not in trouble because we're not there.
But unfortunately, they are threatened by human beings because we are taking their land, we are polluting their resources. So, as you say, in essence, if we let them be, we wouldn't be much of a threat to them. There was one other interesting model video that you created from using the biologist Volterra's example of rabbits on an island. Can you explain how rabbits have births and deaths and what that was about?
Let's assume that you have an island and you put 2 rabbits on the island. And over time, they reproduce, and then they reproduce again, and then they reproduce again, and then they keep on reproducing, and you end up with this population hockey stick curve that everybody's familiar with. And then as the rabbits get to the point where they're eating all of the available grass, if they approach their limit gently, pretty soon the grass supply and the rabbit consumers will equal one another, and they won't go any higher. And that's one of the views of a population that grows. Another view of a population that grows is that it eats all the grass on the island, and a rain comes and it washes the soil off the island. And then no grass grows, and all of the animals are dead. So it's one or the other. It either rises to a level that is in equilibrium with the grass supply, or it ruins the grass supply, and everybody dies. Humans are in exactly the same position. We could limit our population below the supply, or we could grow really big and then destroy the environment and we'll all die. Now, what the model is suggesting is that we control the population at the level that is in equilibrium. But it turns out that the equilibrium with the food supply that the earth can grow and the energy supply which it can deliver, the energy supply is much smaller. So the real future is going to be controlled by the energy supply, not by land area. There'll be lots of land area. When there was only 600 million people on the earth and they lived in the fertile valleys, there were huge expanses that had no people at all. But with the technology they had and the ability to grow food that they had and the energy that they had, they never got more than 600 million. They never got out of those valleys.
What type of economics do we need to have sustainability or viability? What kind of changes for consumers?
In a viable civilization, one that does not deteriorate, individuals can spend their income. The income comes from the hydroelectric dams and is given out in equal-sized portions. It's a real question, Nancy, but it's also built on a whole bunch of pieces that are already built into the system. The private property of the system belongs to the next 100 generations. And the people, the 10 million people who live today, can only lease it. So everybody's a renter to the owners, which are the next 100 generations. And so they won't lease you fossil fuels, because if they did lease you a fossil fuel, you would burn it up. And then the next 100 generations couldn't have it. And so they wouldn't lease it to you at all. Not only that, but this 100-generation committee is responsible for, like, when you rent an apartment, you put down a damage deposit. Well, in this civilization, when you get a piece of the mass, they put a recycling charge on it so that if you abandon it, they'll come and get it and recycle it for you. But you prepaid the recycling.
Talk about the need for behavioral changes. What would those include?
The behavioral changes are making the transition from where we are to these small civilizations. Once you're in the civilization, your behavior is essentially unbounded.
When we return in a moment, we're going to talk more about overpopulation and its impact, but we're also going to talk about some of the solutions with my guest, Jack Alpert, with the Stanford Knowledge Integration Laboratory.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310 559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Jack Alpert, founder and director of the Stanford Knowledge Integration Laboratory. You believe that there must be democratic processes to make changes to our social contract and to have people recognize that too many people on this planet means that we aren't living sustainably. We have the species extinction, we have starvation, social conflict, our footprint is horrible, and that there is not equal distribution of resources so everybody can have a quality of life. But you also have a radical number that you think is the carrying capacity of this planet, and that's under 1 billion people. 100 million? How are we going to get that?
That's a very good question. And the answer is, how did we get prohibition put in place? Prohibition was the removing of alcohol from the American society. And while it didn't last more than, 10, 12 years, there was a group that collected enough votes to say, we're not going to have drunks in our community. And they passed that amendment. And they did it grassroots. It turns out that abolition is the same, that people said having slaves is a bad idea. It's inhumane. We're going to make a rule that says you can't have slaves. Now, that group did not go to Southern slave owners and try to get them to stop having slaves. They passed the rule, and then they forced the consequence on the other half. So my model for getting the population from 8 billion down to 100 million or 50 million is that we need 3 billion people to vote into the social contract the controls over how we determine the size of the population.
People don't want to give up their freedoms, though.
Exactly. And so it's the same problem. Let's assume you live in a city and there's intersection that gets busier and busier and busier, and there's accidents every Friday night, and people are losing their children. And the question was, how did they decide to change the intersection from a free-for-all, everybody has their freedoms, to a stop-and-go light, which took everybody's freedom away? And what happened was they decided that taking away the freedom of action at the intersection was a smaller penalty than not taking away those freedoms and having these people be injured. People have to recognize who is going to be injured and when in the world. And then they have to be able to say, if the only way we can keep that from happening is to take away a freedom, in this particular case, it's the freedom to have children. This turns out to be a really terrible thing and then an inconsequential thing. First, it's a terrible thing because if they voted for it and they put in a system that only gave out a small number of birth permits each year and everybody else in the community was sterile, the permits allowed you to reverse the sterility. Under those circumstances, you could say, we want 50 million people at the end of 100 years. How many births can we have each year? Turns out that we can only have 500,000 births. So that's how many women can have a baby in a given year. Then in 100 years, the population, all the people that were alive when you put this system in place, they're all dead by old age. What's the population? It's 100 cohorts of 500,000, which is 50 million people. It sounds like a terrible thing that you just imposed. Only one woman in 140 will have a child, and all the other 139 others will not have any children at all. And that's what you're voting for. We're talking about people deciding that this terrible infringement on freedom is better than going forward and having the 8 to 10 billion people die of starvation between now and 2100, because that's what's going to happen if we do nothing.
It's really an issue of individual choices versus societal needs and choices. And right. I know that on your website, www.skil.org, skill, but with one L, you have lots of valuable information. And you made reference to a very early environmental commentary on this very issue by the founder of human ecology, Garrett Hardin, with his Tragedy of the Commons. And can you explain what that Tragedy of the Commons is?
Sure. It's what happens to a piece of property that belongs to everyone in the community. And if each actor is independent, let's assume that the area can support 100 cows, and those cows are going to put out 100 gallons of milk with the grass that can grow in this little commons. Now the question is, if one of the farmers says, well, I'll put the 11th cow, there are 10 farmers, they all have 10 cows, he says, I'm going to have 11 cows. So he puts the 11th cow in, and it turns out that he gets 11 101ths of the grass. So he gets an extra portion. Everybody else loses a little portion. They still have 10 cows, but they're getting 10 101ths. So if he adds the extra cow, he gets the advantage because he gets the extra milk. The commons itself is still turning out 100 gallons of milk.
Basically, the commons can only handle so many, or it's the same situation as with the rabbits overeating the grass, and then
Right.
there's nothing for anybody.
Well, it's even a little simpler than that. It turns out that as soon as the smart farmer adds the 11th cow, other farmers recognize what he's done, and they start adding cows to their herds. And pretty soon, all 10 farmers have got 11 cows in their herd. But now, those 11 cows are only producing 10 gallons of milk because the commons can only has enough grass to produce 100 gallons. And so what they've done is they've unsuccessfully taken advantage of the commons. Your comment just a second ago was that not only are there 110 cows in the commons, but they're pooping 110 times, and the grass is being eaten shorter to the ground, and we could run the risk of losing the whole thing. And so what Garrett Hardin said is the only way to manage this problem of individual behavior is mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. The 10 farmers say nobody can put in the 11th cow. If they do put in the 11th cow, they gang up on him and they make him stop. So he doesn't have perfect freedom in the commons. He has freedoms in the commons that will allow it to work and not degrade.
Dr. Hardin wrote about this in the 1960s, and it's still so relevant now.
Right. It's called The Tragedy of the Commons. It was in the journal Science, and we keep violating it. We don't have mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon.
You do have solutions. Your organization is very involved in something called cognition-based solutions to global problems, and that you believe there is a need for rapid population decline to reach a stable carrying capacity for the Earth. Can you explain what cognition-based solutions are?
Sure. Let's go back to the tragedy of the commons. I claim there's 3 kinds of cognition of these 10 farmers. The first kind of cognition is the one that says, I can recognize that if I put the 11th cow in, I get an advantage. There's the second kind of cognition that just goes along with the flow and lets it happen. And the third kind of cognition that says, I recognize that if everybody adds the 11th cow, it's not worth it. And we need the third kind of cognition. We have to be able to shape our own personal behaviors, or our social contract has to shape our own personal behaviors based on a view of the future, a mechanical view of the future. Here, I can give you an example. The society that I designed for the North American continent with only 10 million people on it, it turns out that in a developed society, you have to have an equal number of births as deaths. Because if you have too small a number of births, you end up losing the first chair violinist in your symphony. So if you have 3 women and each of them has 2 children, then the population will remain constant and you won't lose the violinist. But in a normal developed society, about a third of the women will have 0 children. The 2 babies won't be born. About a third of the women will have only 1 child by choice or health. So you take those 3 children and you drop them on the third. The third woman in that group of 3 has to have 5 children, so that together they make 6 kids and they keep the population constant. Now, if a woman didn't want 5 children, she wanted 4, that would be okay as long as another woman would have 6. And if a woman didn't want 3, she wanted 2, then some other woman would have to have 8. Does that make sense? Now, in this civilization, in the social contract, the group has to take responsibility for taxing the entire 10 million individuals and using the money to encourage women to use the extra birth permits. So the group takes responsibility not for keeping the population from growing. It takes responsibility to make sure it doesn't shrink. So when you talk about cognitive abilities, who would imagine that in a developed society, the problem would be too few kids? But you'd have to do that. You have to anticipate it. You have to put that control in the system without experience. You have to put those controls in before the population got so small that not only did you lose the first chair violinist, but you didn't have any garbage collectors or pediatricians or whatever. The idea is that you must be able to think in the domain of what is going to happen in 50 or 100 years. That problem that we didn't imagine has got to influence our behavior today.
On your website, you have activities to help people understand the relationship between population and civilization viability. And you also have activities especially for educators and students. You have the Introducing Civilization Viability as a curriculum from primary schools through college. What are some of those activities?
Well, I think the most basic activity is that every person living should have a number for who is going to die of starvation and conflict in the next 80 years. Nobody has that number. When we talk about climate change, it isn't converted into the number of people who are going to die. And so we could just say, if we improve climate change a little bit, then we reduce the injuries. I'm claiming that everybody needs a number for who's going to get injured and when. As you go through school, that number gets updated, and that you need the cognitive abilities to create the number. Because if you can't visualize or give meaning to who's going to get injured, then you can't shape your own personal behaviors.
You have been working in this field for decades, and I remember many years ago are doing an interview about these same topics. What changes have you seen in terms of awareness of the overpopulation problem and people willing to make the changes necessary to tackle this issue?
I think we've gone the other way, Nancy. I think that we were more concerned about overpopulation when the Meadows wrote their book and the Ehrlichs wrote their book. I think we've distracted ourselves, and now we're worried about climate change and biodiversity. And I think those are distractions. I think the problem is much bigger, much sooner, much faster, and we're fiddling while Rome burns.
Indeed. Dr. Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb in 1968, and it had a major impact on the environmental community, and yet, as you say, the environmental community is focusing now on other issues rather than the numbers of people on the planet.
I feel very strongly that if we would have taken the Meadows and the Ehrlichs in hand, that's when I started working on it in 1972, that we could have been down to 2 billion people by now. Like, I'm arguing that we can only have one woman and 140 have a child, that's the transition mode. It only lasts for 50 years, by the way. After 50 years, every woman can have as many children as they want. I explained what happens when the fertility cohort is very small. The reference to Dennis and Donella Meadows, the book Limits to Growth, was an MIT group that actually did the mathematical computations for sustainable civilizations. They called it Limits to Growth. They could have renamed the book We're on Our Way to a Bad Place, but they wouldn't sell any copies. So they changed the name to Limits to Growth. Even the word limits to growth is a distraction. We need a civilization that fits into the niche that Mother Nature builds. And we're so much bigger than that niche right now that even if we stop growing, it wouldn't solve any problems. The same number of people will die if we stop growth. If everybody had one child per family right now, which was my focus for 1972 to 1992, it no longer is a solution. Even if everybody had one child per family all over the earth, the population would not go down fast enough to keep us from having 8 to 10 billion people starve to death in the next 80 years.
These issues are so complex, and you've given us so much food for thought and made us aware that we do have to consider the impact of how many people are on the planet and what is happening because of that and how we can possibly make some changes. Thank you so very much for enlightening us on these critical issues. Thank you for being my guest.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Nancy. I'm glad we had time to do this. And your listeners should feel free to send me email. I need your views and your comments. My email address is Alpert, at skill.org.
Thank you. I have been speaking with Jack Alpert, who is founder and director of the Stanford Knowledge Integration Laboratory. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.